Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Imagine a child being born not into innocence but into a curse. His first breath was not a celebration of life, but a continuation of something far darker, a legacy of bloodlines that folded in on themselves. The neighbors whispered, the family buried its secrets, and the town looked away, because this was no ordinary child. This was the child of a sister, the living proof of a lineage that broke the most sacred boundary. Tonight we unravel the story of a boy born from his own sister, a tale that sounds too horrific to be true, yet is etched into the forgotten records of America's most hidden bloodlines. The kind of story your grandfather might have overheard at the edge of a bar, or perhaps one that was half mentioned in a family argument before being quickly silenced. It is a story no one wanted told, but history has a way of clawing back through the dirt. The truth is that in some corners of rural America, far from the watchful eyes of cities and authorities, family trees began to grow in strange, twisted shapes. Poverty, isolation, shame, and secrecy became the soil. And out of that soil, families like this one took root, repeating the same cycle of broken unions until even they couldn't remember where the line of father and brother ended or where the line of sister and mother began. The boy at the center of our story was whispered about before he could even speak. His features were marked by the shadow of his bloodline, his jaw too small, his forehead strangely large, his eyes not quite aligned. To outsiders, he was simply strange. But to those who knew the truth, he was evidence, a breathing, fragile reminder of sins no one dared put into words. We're going to step carefully into this history. What you're about to hear is not a fable, not a campfire story, but a chilling record of what happens when isolation consumes a family and shame becomes stronger than love. This is not the history in textbooks. This is the history that people burned, buried, and denied. Yet it still lingers, like a ghost walking through the blood. The family in question lived at the edges of America's forgotten map, in a valley so deep that sunlight reached the ground only for a few hours a day. Generations had been born and buried there, their graves marked by crude stones or not marked at all. Outsiders rarely ventured into the valley, and those who did often spoke of the silence, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as though the land itself wanted its secrets kept. It was in this place that brother and sister became something more. The boy's mother was only a teenager when her older brother began taking what he believed belonged to him. In a world with no watchful eyes, there was no one to intervene. She was not his partner, she was not his wife. She was his blood, claimed as though the boundaries of family had dissolved into nothing. By the time she understood what had been taken from her, it was already too late. She was carrying his child. The child who would one day grow into a quiet, troubled boy was born in a small wooden shack with only his grandmother present. The grandmother had lived long enough to see it happen before. She had been raised in the same soil of silence, where fathers blurred into uncles, where cousins shared both names and blood. For her, the birth was not a shock. It was an inevitability. From the very beginning, the boy bore the weight of his origin. His cries were strange, his body frail, his features twisted. The people in the valley noticed, but no one spoke openly. In communities like these, silence was survival. The shame of naming the truth was greater than the horror of letting it continue. Families closed their doors, neighbors looked away, and the children of such unions were left to carry the evidence on their faces, their bodies, and their minds. He was raised in a house where every adult knew his father was also his uncle, and his mother was also his sister. He was surrounded by people who pretended nothing was wrong. Yet, the truth sat heavy in every glance, every pause, every whisper when strangers came close, and as he grew, so did the shadows around him. The boy was not only born of his sister, he was born into a bloodline that had been unraveling for decades, a bloodline that would not stop with him. As the boy grew older, the signs of his origin became impossible to ignore. His body was fragile, often racked with unexplained illness. His speech came late, his words broken and slurred, as though his tongue itself carried the weight of his lineage. Children in nearby towns mocked him when they saw him, calling him simple or wrong, but they never understood the truth. Only those within his valley knew why his eyes crossed, why his jaw jutted, why his mind seemed locked in a fog. His mother, his sister, carried her own torment. She was still little more than a child herself, forced to become both mother and victim in a single breath. Her life had been stolen, reshaped into a vessel for her brother's desire, and now she lived with the constant reminder in the form of her son. Some said she looked at him with sorrow. Others claimed her eyes carried resentment. But whatever she felt, she could not escape him, just as she could not escape the bloodline that created him. The father, her brother, walked the valley with a kind of unspoken authority. He did not feel shame. To him this was simply continuation, something that had been practiced before him, something that would continue after him. He told himself it was survival, that in their isolation they had no choice but to keep their blood within the valley. But deep down, those who watched him knew the truth. It was not about survival, it was about power. Power over his sister, power over his family, power over a child who would never truly be whole. Outside the valley, the story began to spread in whispers. A traveling preacher spoke of a family cursed by their own blood. A doctor in a neighboring town recorded strange abnormalities in his notes after examining one of the children. Rumors filtered outward like smoke from a dying fire, too faint to draw the full attention of the world, but strong enough to make all outsiders uneasy about venturing too close. Still, the boy remained. Year after year he grew older, his body struggling against itself, his mind caught between clarity and confusion. Yet, in his quiet presence, he became the greatest evidence of what the valley tried hardest to deny. He was living proof that the family tree had twisted so far it had begun to strangle itself. And though he did not know it, his very existence was already writing the story that would outlive them all. By the time the boy reached adolescence, the cracks in the bloodline were not just physical, they were spiritual. He seemed to move through life like a shadow, present but somehow not fully alive. His thoughts came slowly, his emotions flickered without warning, and his body often betrayed him with sudden fits or trembling. In the valley, people whispered that he was cursed. Some claimed his very presence brought misfortune, that animals grew restless when he passed, that crops wilted in the soil he touched. To the outside world, these were superstitions. But within the valley, they were truths, passed from one frightened mouth to another. The boy's mother, his sister, withered with time. What had been stolen from her in youth never returned, and she became a ghost of herself. Neighbors noticed how she avoided the boy's gaze, how she seemed haunted by the sight of his face. It was said she would sometimes wander into the woods alone, whispering to no one, her voice carried by the wind as if confessing to an unseen judge. In her silence she bore not only her own pain, but the heavy knowledge that her child was both her son and her brother's. The father remained unmoved. He continued his life as though nothing were wrong, as though he had done nothing more than claim what was his. Yet even he could not silence the unease that lingered when he looked at the boy, for the boy was a reflection of himself, distorted, broken, twisted by the unnatural bond that had created him. It was a mirror he could never look away from. There were others in the valley, cousins, uncles, relatives bound together by blood that had looped and folded over itself too many times. Some of them bore their own marks, slurred speech, strange movements, stunted growth. To outsiders, it was coincidence. To those inside, it was inheritance. The valley was producing its own kind of people, shaped not by the vastness of the world, but by the confines of a single family line. And still, the town beyond the valley turned away. Outsiders avoided questions, dismissed rumors, and allowed the family to remain hidden. because to acknowledge them was to face something too grotesque, too unnatural, something that challenged the very idea of what family is meant to be. The boy lived on, marked by his blood, carrying a legacy that was never his choice to bear. But the story of his bloodline was not finished. It would deepen, grow darker, and spread its shadow even further. The deeper one looks into this bloodline, the more it becomes clear that the boy was not an accident of fate, but the product of a long, unbroken chain. His existence was not the beginning of the curse, it was the latest link in it. For generations the family had folded in upon itself, fathers who were also uncles, daughters who became mothers to their own siblings, cousins who were raised as brothers and sisters, only for those roles to blur again when secrecy allowed desire to take its place. The boy became the most visible reminder of that history. When he walked through the valley, people avoided his eyes, afraid of the truth they saw staring back. His face carried the unmistakable signature of what happens when bloodlines grow too close. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone who looked at him was forced to confront the reality of what had been happening in silence for decades. The valley had turned into a closed loop where shame, secrecy, and silence acted as mortar, holding the collapsing walls of the family together. No help came in from the outside, and no one left. It was a prison without bars, built from tradition, fear, and the heavy weight of keeping it in the family. By the time the boy reached his teenage years, his fate seemed sealed. He was not expected to escape the valley. He was expected to continue it, to pass on the bloodline the way his father had, the way his grandfather had, the way the soil of that cursed place demanded. But there is something chilling in imagining a boy, born from his own sister, being prepared, silently, to continue the same cycle himself. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken free, or would you have carried the weight of silence like so many before you? What makes this story so haunting is that it is not isolated. The boy's tale echoes countless others hidden across forgotten corners of America, where isolation breeds secrets, and secrets breed horrors. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. As the years passed, the boy's life became less about living and more about enduring. Each day he carried the unspoken truth carved into his very body. His speech never fully formed, his thoughts often wandered, and his eyes remained forever marked by the blood that created him. He was not only a victim of circumstance, he was a living archive of the family's sins. And yet, despite the weight of it all, he continued to breathe, continued to exist, as though defying the world that wished he would fade quietly into the background. The valley grew quieter in those years. Outsiders seldom came, but when they did, they left unsettled. A traveling doctor once recorded in his private journal that the children of this family were unlike any others he had seen. He wrote of faces that seemed both young and aged, voices that slurred as though heavy with invisible burdens, bodies that trembled without reason. His words were never published. They were tucked away, hidden in notebooks that gathered dust, just like the family itself. Within the household, the silence only deepened. The boy's mother, his sister, descended into a shadow of herself. Some whispered that she no longer recognized the world outside her grief. Others claimed she had begun to speak to figures no one else could see, her voice echoing through the shack at night like a confession to the dead. Whether madness or mourning, no one knew. What was certain is that she, too, was being consumed by the same bloodline that had trapped her son. The father remained the constant. He worked the land, spoke little, and lived as though nothing was broken. To him, the boy's deformities were not a curse, they were proof. Proof that the family's blood was strong enough to survive even when folded back on itself, but what he called strength, others knew as corruption. The valley began to decay around them. Abandoned houses sagged under the weight of time, and fields turned barren. It was as though the land itself reflected the people who lived upon it, worn down, hollow, unable to thrive. And yet, through it all, the boy lingered. His survival was not triumph, but torment. Every breath he took was a reminder that the sins of the bloodline could not be buried. They lived on, etched into flesh and bone. The story of this boy was not simply about his life, it was about the legacy he would leave, whether he wanted to or not. The boy's life ended much as it began, quietly, without ceremony, and without the dignity that every human deserves. When he died, there was no headstone carved with his name, no marker to honor the years he endured. His body was lowered into the same cursed soil that had birthed him, the same ground that had swallowed generations before him, and with him, the valley swallowed another secret. But death did not end his story. If anything, it gave it weight, for in the absence of records, whispers took root. Travelers who passed through the region spoke of a family that never mixed with outsiders. Old men in neighboring towns swore they had once seen a boy with a crooked jaw and hollow eyes walking along the dirt road, staring as though he were looking through them. Preachers muttered of God's punishment, while skeptics dismissed it all as superstition. Yet the silence of those who lived in the valley, their refusal to ever speak of him, was louder than any rumor. The boy became less a person and more a warning, a reminder of what happens when bloodlines fold back into themselves, when shame is buried instead of confronted, when power is allowed to masquerade as tradition. He was not just the child of his sister, he was the embodiment of a cycle that had consumed everyone before him and threatened to consume those after. His life was proof that secrecy can twist itself into permanence, that silence is not protection, but a prison. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: his story is not unique. Across the forgotten corners of America, there are valleys, hollows, and hidden towns where family trees grow in unnatural shapes, where children are born carrying the scars of their ancestry, where shame runs so deep that even graves cannot contain it. The boy was only one chapter in a much larger book, one that most would prefer never to open. Yet here we are, turning its page, looking at what was never meant to be seen, listening to a story that families tried to bury, that history tried to erase, but that blood itself refused to forget, because some stories do not die. They live on in whispers, in shadows, in the faces of those who cannot escape the past. And perhaps, somewhere, in another forgotten valley, another child already carries the weight of a bloodline that should never have been.